My grandmother's village had about 80 people in it when I was a child. I don't want to name it. People from there still live there, and they didn't ask to be part of this story. What I'll tell you is that it was in a flat agricultural region surrounded on all sides by wheat fields that stretched so far in every direction that as a child I genuinely believed the world was just the village and then wheat forever. I spent one summer there when I was 9. My parents were dealing with something. I was too young to be told what. And I was sent to stay with my grandmother for 3 months. I loved my grandmother. I want to say that clearly. She was a small, serious woman who made bread every morning and knew the name of every person in that village, going back 4 generations, and who loved me in the practical, unsentimental way of someone who shows love through feeding you and keeping you safe rather than saying so. She kept me very safe that summer. I didn't understand how hard she was working at that until I was much older. The village sat in the middle of the fields, like something the fields were tolerating rather than surrounding. One main road through it, houses on both sides, a well in the center that nobody used anymore, but that everyone kept clean anyway. A small church at the far end. The wheat came right up to the back fences of the houses on both sides of the road. In summer, it was taller than me, taller than most adults, and it moved constantly, even when there wasn't enough wind to feel on your skin. I loved the wheat when I arrived. I stopped loving it by the end of the first week. The first thing I noticed was the birds. There were no birds in the fields. This sounds small. It isn't. Wheat fields in summer are loud with birds. Crows, sparrows, everything that eats grain. You chase them away and they come back. Every farmer I've spoken to since then describes it as a constant battle. In my grandmother's village that summer, there were no birds in the wheat at all. They flew over it. They landed in the village, on the rooftops, on the well. They didn't land in the wheat. I asked my grandmother about it. She said, "Birds are smarter than people give them credit for." I asked what that meant. She said, "It means don't go into the wheat, Dina. Stay on this side of the fence." Her tone closed the subject completely. The second thing I noticed was the scarecrow. It stood at the edge of the field directly behind my grandmother's house, just visible above the back fence. Old wood cross frame, stuffed clothing, the usual construction. Nothing unusual about it in daylight. But every morning when I woke up, before I went downstairs, I would look out my bedroom window at the field. And the scarecrow was never in the same position. Not dramatically different. Not moved to a different location. Just its angle slightly changed. The tilt of the head. The position of the arms on the crossbar. Small variations that individually I could have attributed to wind or my own faulty memory. But every single morning, it was different from the night before. I mentioned it to my grandmother on the 4th day. She went very still for a moment. Then she came upstairs and looked out my window at the scarecrow and stood there for a while without speaking. She said, "From now on, you sleep with the curtain closed." I said, "Is it moving by itself?" She said, "Curtain closed, Dina." All night. I closed the curtain, but I was 9 years old, and it was summer, and I couldn't sleep well in total darkness. So I left a small gap, 2 inches, maybe 3, at the edge of the curtain. I know. I was 9. The 3rd night with the curtain closed, I woke at some point in the deep dark. I had no clock in the room. I don't know the time. Somewhere between midnight and dawn. And lay in the dark and listened. The village was completely quiet. I looked at the thin line of pale light at the edge of the curtain, and I noticed that the light had changed, not disappeared, not blocked completely, but the quality of it was different, dimmer, interrupted, the way a light changes when something moves in front of it and partially obscures it. Something was on the other side of the curtain, outside my window. I was on the second floor. I have tried many times over the years to describe what I felt in that moment, and the most accurate thing I can say is that my body made a decision before my mind did. I didn't think, don't move. I just didn't move. I was completely still before I'd consciously chosen to be still. Some older part of me that didn't need thought took over and lay flat and didn't breathe. The light at the edge of the curtain stayed changed. It stayed that way for a long time. I don't know how long. I was 9, and I had no clock, and time does something strange when you're that frightened. It becomes meaningless, just an ongoing fact of the dark with no measurement to it. I stared at the ceiling, and I did not move. Then the light went back to normal. Whatever had been outside the window was gone. I lay there until daylight. I went to my grandmother's room at 6 a.m. She was already awake, sitting up in bed as though she'd been awake for hours, which I think she had. I sat on the edge of her bed, and I said, "Something was outside my window last night." She looked at me. She said, "Did you open the curtain?" I said no. I didn't tell her about the gap. She pulled me close and held me for a while without saying anything, which was unusual for her. Not a cold woman, but not a physically demonstrative one. And that embrace told me more than words would have. Then she said, "From tonight you sleep in my room." I said, "Grandma, what is it?" She said, "It's old. It's been here longer than the village, longer than anything I know about." And she paused. She said, "It watches. That's what it does. It stands at the edge and it watches. And as long as you don't look at it directly, it stays at the edge." I said, "What happens if you look at it?" She was quiet. She said, "The Vorik family looked at it. 3 of them in one night, years before you were born. The father had heard something outside, and he looked through his window, and then he woke his wife to show her, and she looked. And then his eldest son came in to see what was happening, and he looked too." She stopped. I said, "What happened to them?" She said, "They were found in the morning, sitting in the kitchen, all 3 of them, sitting very still. They were alive, breathing, eyes open, but they didn't speak, didn't respond, didn't eat or drink. The father stayed that way for 11 days before he died. The wife for 6. The boy." She stopped again. She said, "The boy was 12. He lasted 3 weeks." She held me tighter. She said, "They were sitting facing the window, all 3 of them, the window that faced the field." I slept in my grandmother's room for the rest of that summer. I didn't look out of any window that faced the field after dark. Not once. But I want to tell you about the last week of August, the week before my parents came to take me home. I was in the kitchen helping my grandmother with dinner. Late afternoon, still full daylight, the sun coming through the kitchen window at a low angle. I looked up from what I was doing and looked out the window, not thinking, just looking up. And I saw the wheat, and I saw the scarecrow. It was facing the house. Now I want to be careful here because I was 9, and memory is not perfect, and I will not tell you something I'm not sure of. I am sure of this. When I had looked out my bedroom window at the beginning of the summer, the scarecrow's face, such as it was, just a stuffed sack, had been angled toward the road. It was now facing the house directly, and its arms, they had been on the crossbar, out to the sides, the normal position. They were down, hanging at its sides. I stood at the kitchen window and stared at it. My grandmother said my name. I turned. She was looking at where I was looking. Her face was calm in the way a face is calm. When it is working very hard to be calm, she said, "Come and stir this." I said, "Grandma, the scarecrow." She said, "Dina, come and stir this. Don't look at the field." I went and stirred the pot. She came and stood next to me, and after a moment she put her hand over mine on the spoon. She said quietly, "It's been a long summer. You've been very good. A few more days and you go home." I said, "Does it know I'm here?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "It knows everyone here. It's always known everyone here." She said, "That's not what matters." I said, "What matters?" She said, "What matters is what it does with knowing." She gave my hand a small squeeze. She said, "It hasn't done anything. It's watched, and it stayed at the edge. Because we've kept the rules all summer." She went back to the stove. I kept stirring. I didn't look at the field again. My parents came to get me on the 1st of September. We drove away on the main road, and I watched the village get smaller through the back window. The wheat on both sides of the road, tall and still. As we reached the edge of the village, I looked toward my grandmother's house one last time. I could see the top of the scarecrow above the fence. It was facing the road, facing our car. I turned around and looked forward, and didn't look back. My grandmother died when I was 26. I went back for the funeral, stayed 2 nights. The village had about 60 people left in it by then, smaller and quieter than I remembered. The wheat was still there. The scarecrow was still there. On the first night in my grandmother's house, I woke at some point in the deep dark and lay still and looked at the ceiling, and the light under the door of my room changed. Just slightly. Just enough. I closed my eyes. I lay completely still. I didn't move until morning. I'm 38 now. I live in a city. 6th floor. No fields anywhere near me. I still sleep with the curtain fully closed. I don't look out of windows at night. My husband thinks it's a quirk. Some things you don't explain to people who didn't grow up the way you grew up. Some things you just carry quietly and make sure the curtain is closed. Every night, without fail,